Daniel Knowles is the Midwest correspondent for The Economist and the author of the new book, Carmageddon: How Cars Make Life Worse and What to Do About It. Daniel, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you ever so much for having me on, Ty. It's a pleasure.
Well, what made you want to write this book?
So the book's got, I think it's something that I've been kind of mulling, thinking about, that been in my head for probably a decade or more. I when I first moved to London as a kind of fresh bushy-tailed journalist about 12 years ago, I got everywhere by bike, and I used to get into all these and you realize how difficult it was, especially London then. It was kind of a bit like what Chicago is now. There were bike lanes and things, but it didn't feel quite safe yet. They didn't have the bike infrastructure that they have now, and you still felt like a bit of a weirdo getting to work on a bike, and you'd kind of get into these arguments with drivers, who are cutting you up, that sort of thing. And I remember, once getting chased down the road by a guy who got out of his car. He was so angry with the way I'd overtaken him or something, and Vauxhall Bridge Road. So that's kind of there. And then I think when I began thinking, do you know what, somebody should write a book about this, was when I was living in Kenya. And that was about 5 years ago. And in Kenya, it was the only place I lived in Nairobi, the capital, and it was the only place I've ever had to rely on a car sort of, every day. And I had the little car. It's the only time I've owned a car. And living there and realizing, in this city where I'm not sure what percentage of the population own cars, but it can't be more than 10 to 20% at most. And yet everybody's stuck in traffic jams. The air pollution is appalling. And the people who don't own cars, like, it's bad if you're driving, but most people have to get by the city that's very sprawling, very difficult to kind of live in. There's new suburbs being built everywhere, and where all the jobs are, it tends to be where the rich people are and spread out on this kind of sprawling layout. But most people can't afford to get cars, so they have to travel by foot or by bicycle, by kind of quite dysfunctional public transport, to these out of town, very almost very suburban sort of developments. And so it kind of fails for everybody. And that was when I began thinking about how car culture was spreading globally, in a way that I think if you live somewhere like London, or you live somewhere like New York City, or it can feel like we are turning a corner and it's going the other way. But in lots of parts of the world, the car is really still taking off, and this quite American kind of approach to transport is spreading still quite fast. So that was really when I began thinking it. And then the pandemic happened, and by that time I'd moved back to the UK. I was in London, and it was one of the few upsides of the pandemic was it was suddenly very quiet on the road. So things are going to move quite fast. This pandemic is dreadful, but that was one kind of silver lining. And then I moved here to Chicago, and got to spend time looking at America, and I'd lived in the US before, but I think kind of coming back with these thoughts in my head at the sort of the most car-centric country in the world, that's the sort of three-part way and of how the book came about. So yeah, and there is the train for you, if you can hear it.
I'm trying to capture that train noise on this conversation about cars and public transportation. I love it. I love it. So this book provides a really great history of how cars took over the world. You already kind of touched on it in your explanation as to why you wanted to write this book. But I want to start there. At what point did city planners and urban architects start designing places to be more car-centric?
So I spent quite a bit of time in the history of this, and it sort of depends where you're looking at. But if you're looking at the United States, really the 1920s and 1930s, and there's a historian called Peter Norton who's done some incredible work on this, in the US context, that is, where he looks at in the 1920s, 1930s, you had a really rapid increase in the ownership of cars in the US, and that's when you had the development of, so one of the places I wrote about in the book is a place called Radburn, which is in New Jersey. That was a kind of suburb built as garden city for the automotive age, but one of the very first sort of era of suburbs built with cars in mind. But you had the 1920s when, you know, the first jaywalking laws passed. You had roads being, or streets being widened to make way for cars and sidewalks narrowed. You had and you had this kind of huge pressure that basically came from a massive rise in the number of deaths from car crashes, as cars kind of began to fill up the roads, and people, you know, children especially, were dying in car crashes. What happened in the US was this rapid adoption of essentially a model which said, okay, well, we need to separate the cars from the people, which means we need to keep the people out of the roads. We need to kind of have separate fast roadways, highways, elevated highways. You know, there was just, I mean, if you read back, you find old issues of like old newspapers. I was reading one the other day from the Chicago Tribune from the 1930s saying, oh, we need elevated motorways, expressways, to kind of reduce the Carmageddon, I think, might actually have been a word used in it, but in this thing. But it's so in the kind of interwar period in the US was when really it began happening quite dramatically, and I think because cars were much less common in elsewhere in the world, you know, including in Europe in that period, it came later. So in the UK, it was really the 1950s and 1960s when it happened, and even that was interesting, because so there was this fantastic book called Traffic in Towns, which was originally a government report by a guy called Buchanan. What was his first name? Patrick, I think. But Buchanan's Traffic in Towns, which kind of essentially said, oh, well, you know, everybody's got cars. There's 10 million cars in the country now. In 10 years, there's going to be 30 million. We can't stop anybody buying them. And it's going to be terrible. And so, and in America, it's not gone particularly well. So how can we redesign our cities around cars in a way that, you know, is less damaging, but still lets everybody drive everywhere? And I think it's kind of, you know, you can see the different ways in which it happened in Europe that was perhaps a bit less dramatic than in the US, but still essentially the same principle of, oh God, we've got to redesign everything around cars. So, and now it's happening in, you know, in other parts of the world, like India or parts of Africa. It's what's happening, you know, what happened 100 years ago in America is literally happening right now, with kind of places being redesigned around cars, bypasses being jammed through old cities, that sort of thing. So it's still happening.
How much political influence did the big car companies have over these decisions?
I mean, quite a bit. So what's great about the kind of 20s and 30s here, not great, but what's great about Peter Norton's research into that period is that, you know, he talks about there was this group, this lobby group that called itself Motordom. And it was actually less the manufacturers, which tended to be, you know, they're all concentrated in Michigan. It was car dealers and wealthy people who did own cars, but particularly the kind of the industry that serviced cars and sold them. Car dealerships were the drivers of Motordom, and they really pushed hard for, you know, for jaywalking laws, for things like, you know, they organized their own kind of safety demonstrations, which were in response to these protests against cars, in which they kind of, you know, reposition this idea of safety as being how pedestrians needed to modify their behavior to stay off the roads, to make it easier for car drivers to be able to drive at a decent speed. You know, in Cincinnati, I can't remember the exact year, but there was a proposal to force every car coming into the city to be required to have a like a speed limiter on it, and that was very successfully resisted by this kind of organized lobby group. So there was definitely an element to which, you know, the industry pushed for this, but I think, you know, you can go too hard on the conspiracy element. I think there's also just a sort of you know, I just tried to outline in the book, there's a kind of a coordination problem that caused the rise of cars too, a kind of prisoner's dilemma, which is, you know, if everybody else walks everywhere, everybody else doesn't have a car, and you're the first person to get a car, your car is great for you, and it gets you from A to B really quickly, and it's fantastic. But then as more people start getting cars, suddenly those benefits begin to diminish, and because you're in congestion. All of a sudden, the pollution of everybody else's cars is affecting you. And I think there was just a kind of problem where cars started out as this very liberating, aspirational thing for sort of rich people, and that meant everybody wanted to have one. But as everyone got one, the benefits that they had for rich people couldn't stay. Like, everybody wants to live in a big suburban house and have their own car in a neighborhood that's dense, where everybody else in the neighborhood kind of lives in an apartment and walks around, so that that's the only way you can have the best of both worlds. And I think basically it kind of set that's actually what happened, was this people got cars because other people were getting them, and after a while, as stuff got redesigned for the people with cars, not having a car became implausible. It became impossible. So it went from a car being freedom to essentially not cars being required, and not having a car being imprisonment, as the number of cars grew.
Yeah, and like so many other aspects of American society, the history of the car and the driving infrastructure is inextricably linked to racism and classism. So how did decisions to prioritize car driving disproportionately impact Black and poor communities in America?
Well, particularly from the sort of 1950s, late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when federal highway funding meant that the building out of the interstate network meant that cities got this extraordinary amount of funding from the federal government to build roads. For every sort of $9 that they would put into building a road, for every $10 that would go putting into a road, the federal government was supplying 9 or sometimes more. So suddenly cities could build these highways, this infrastructure, without having to pay for it themselves. And in an awful lot of cities in the US, including Chicago, where I now am, Detroit as well, Atlanta, they saw this kind of, you had governments that this was happening at the same time as you had the great migration of African Americans moving up from kind of agricultural parts of southern states to industrial cities and getting jobs. And so there was this anxiety about Black people moving into cities, and there was all this money available for roads. And so an awful lot of kind of city mayors and city planners and people in charge saw the ability to use these roads as a way to enforce segregation. So in Detroit, there was a neighborhood called Black Bottom, where I was actually last year, where they're now proposing to tear up this part of the Chrysler Freeway, but it was built right through what was a Black neighborhood in an attempt essentially to get rid of it. And elsewhere, here in Chicago, the Dan Ryan, it wasn't built in quite the same way in the attempt to destroy a Black neighborhood, but it was built and to use as a barrier between what was then a Black neighborhood of Bronzeville and the much more white neighborhood of Bridgeport, essentially to make it much harder for people to kind of move across them. And it's still very difficult if you're on foot to kind of cross between those two neighborhoods. So so road building and segregation kind of went hand in hand through that period, and that legacy is still with us. And of course, it didn't really work in the way that the planners thought it would. They thought they could use these roads to kind of segregate their cities, but what it also enabled was white flight. Once you had these highways that were built through neighborhoods, kind of people, the white middle classes of these cities suddenly realized, oh, they can get to work on the kind of elevator motorway and live in the suburbs and no longer have to pay the property taxes or whatever. So cities began to lose population and get into this kind of downward spiral that many American cities are still struggling with, Detroit or Baltimore, or where they kind of they made it possible for their own residents to leave and to only come back in their cars each morning. So and that makes it difficult to fix some of the kind of racial and class imbalances that still obviously remain very entrenched in American society in the geography. So racism was not caused by the car, but it definitely kind of they fed on each other in a negative way, and the book has a whole section on that. So,
Yeah, and it's still feeding into kind of our inability to improve our public transit, right? Like in cities like Atlanta or here where I am in Indianapolis, I mean, how have improvements to public transit basically been shot down by voters, especially those around, in the suburbs because of their, racist tendencies?
well, right. I mean, I wrote about the example of MARTA in Atlanta, which took them decades to kind of form a regional transport agency. And there's a whole thing with, one of the things that I did not fully understand before spending more time living here is that, a lot of American cities have what on paper in terms of the spending is not terrible public transport, in the sense that they have light rail lines. There are subway lines in certain places. And often a number of cities that have been passing, or regions even, kind of sales taxes to fund public transport. But there's still this problem with the land use. So a lot of times when a city goes and builds a light rail system, or a new commuter train line or something in America, it doesn't connect anywhere that you need to go to anywhere that you want to go, as it were, because there is still this kind of problems around land use. And if your kind of subway system goes to a sprawling suburb with, very exclusionary zoning, so you can only build a house for every half acre or every acre, well, it's not going to be very functional as a transit system. And that's still kind of the problem. I think a lot of American cities in the last kind of 20 or 30 years have realized that that the congestion is getting impossible for everybody to drive, that that they need public transport if they're going to keep growing. And so they're willing to build it, but because of these kind of class and often race influence kind of worries about where people are going to live, and can we build low-income housing in this neighborhood. So it's often kind of the public transport you get is much less valuable than it should be. Los Angeles is a really good example of this, and in that they've built some really good kind of public transport, but it's not actually that well used, because while the lines, and the trains are quite good, the neighborhoods they serve are just not set up for it. And they still have this problem of kind of nobody, there's huge objections to building lower income housing, or to building apartments even. Maybe it's not even lower income, but to building housing around the stations that then might be used by poorer people who people are still worried about bringing into their rich neighborhoods. So it remains a problem in the kind of planning now, even if I think it's much less straightforwardly racist in the way that it was in the 1950s, 1960s, when people were straight up objecting to kind of public transport being built at all into their neighborhoods. Now they will want the public transport into their neighborhoods, but they won't allow the density around the stations that might make it functional.
I'm glad you brought up LA, because that's just like, here in America, one of the shining examples of a city where traffic is just an absolute nightmare. We've got Houston, we've got other cities, obviously, but I'm sure you've seen the memes online showing LA or some other cities' traffic over time with the words, "We just need to add one more lane," written over just like decades of freeway widening. What's the principle of induced demand, and how does that explain why this approach of just adding lanes doesn't work?
So induced demand is basically this idea of if you build it, they will come. And the problem with, so traffic engineers almost for as long as there have been cars on the roads have been trying to tackle the problem of congestion. And, if you read, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, there's all this stuff about how you can just solve the traffic problem. And, in which Jane Jacobs denounces kind of engineers at that time for thinking like that. The problem is basically that road space is free to use most of the time. You don't pay. Obviously there are toll roads and stuff, but most roads that have intense traffic congestion don't have tolls, and so they're free to use. And so traffic is effectively the way in which access to the road space is priced. If there's a massive traffic jam and it's really slow to get somewhere, then you're less likely to use it. And the slower traffic goes, the more kind of can move through move through any given roadway, because there's less space between each car. So the problem with, if you add a lane to a road without kind of introducing any pricing or anything, then what tends to happen is the traffic begins moving faster initially, but pretty quickly, um, enough people realize that the road is moving faster. And so they adjust their travel kind of things. Maybe they, people start going on those, people start driving, I don't know, 5 miles to a supermarket instead of going to one nearby, or or businesses move to a different place on the road, or or people's decisions change essentially. So the traffic gets back to as bad as it was before, and an induced demand is not kind of inherently a bad thing, in the sense of if you widen a road and more people are using it, well, more people are making journeys. But the problem is that what we kind of know in the US is that most of those extra journeys aren't very valuable, because if you put a toll on a road, people won't pay it, even if it's a very small toll. I wrote about an example in Kentucky, Louisville, where the kind of state DOT had this very congested bridge across the river into Indiana, actually, where it was very congested. So they widened the bridge, doubled the number of lanes, but to pay for it, they put a toll on both bridges, and immediately the traffic dropped to what it was before. So they didn't actually need the extra lanes; they just needed the toll. So if you basically, a lot of the problem with kind of expanding highways, widening them forever, is that you'll never be able to satisfy all the demand, because you'll be adding all of these journeys that people will make because it's free, that they wouldn't pay for. So you're spending all this money widening roads to try and solve a problem that you'll never solve, and it's not actually making anybody better off. People are able to travel more, but there are all these costs. You've got to build the road. You're probably making people move or whatever. And the journeys that you're enabling, people wouldn't pay, $1 or $2 to make those journeys. So they don't value them that much. They've actually got alternatives there. So that's kind of why this widening highways approach is, just doomed to failure.
Yeah, it's just causing more and more people to drive, and more traffic and congestion, and that's driving up emissions. This is the Climate Pod. We obviously have to talk about cars' impact on the climate and on the environment. So just how bad is, passenger vehicles to the overall, impact of global warming?
Oh, it's bad. I mean, so on the face of it, if you look at transport emissions in the US, on the face of it, it's about 25%, which is pretty bad on its own. And most of that is cars. Obviously, some is trucks and other forms of transport, but most of that's cars. And that's only parts that's rising. American kind of power plants have been getting more efficient. There's more and more renewable energy. There's less and less coal on the grid. So stuff like that's getting better. Cars are getting worse. And, all over the world, kind of transport emissions are rising really fast. So just the direct emissions are really high. But there's a secondary part, which I think is even more dramatic, which is that, when you have this very car-centric lifestyle, people are much more spread out. They consume much more energy on everything else too. So if you look at, the average New Yorker is responsible for about 5 tons of CO2 emissions a year. The average person in Houston is responsible for something like 15 tons, and across Texas, I think it's maybe close to 20. So if you live in these very kind of spread out cities, or if you live in spread out suburbs or rural areas, you're driving a lot further to do every to make any journey. And that mean, and your house is probably larger, but not only larger, it's not next to somebody else's house. So whereas I live in an apartment, that's kind of means that the heating is spread between a whole building. If you it's much more efficient per kind of square foot to heat it. And if you live in a big house in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing, it's costing you're using a lot more emissions to heat it, to kind of deliveries there, emissions in the rubbish trucks that come and collect your rubbish or garbage each day. So indirectly, the kind of sprawl causes loads of emissions. So it's a quarter of our emissions directly is just our driving around. But then, but the sprawl that is kind of enabled by cars, means that emissions are probably they could easily be, kind of 70% lower if people just lived at the same density that they live in New York City, without having to change what we get, without having to have more renewable electricity. Even if people just lived a more dense lifestyle, that would basically solve a huge proportion of the kind of carbon problem without having to have all this extra energy that we're currently working out how to get from renewable energy. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it makes sense, the car's impact on the environment, on the climate, but also how much they're impacting and they're hurting humans, right? I mean, just the financial, the mental, the physical health impacts of cars are enormous. When you were researching this book, what stood out to you as far as just how negatively impactful cars are onto humans?
So I think it's the financial side, and second, the kind of emotional side. And they're both, I'll do the financial side first, because that's what really shocked me. I knew that kind of driving everywhere is not that great because I hate driving, but like when you realize that, so, for the poorest 20% of Americans, they spend something like a quarter of their gross income on cars, pretty much as they spend on rent. When you look at kind of college students, the cost of transport is almost as much as like the cost of tuition, on average, and not being able to get to college is one of the major reasons why people drop out of kind of university in this country. Car loans are one of the biggest sources of bankruptcy, and that's something that's getting worse right now as interest rates have gone up. People who've had very cheap car loans for a long time are suddenly really struggling to refinance their vehicles at the moment. So people kind of made dependent on cars financially in a way that's incredibly damaging, and it eats up a huge proportion of every kind of family's budget. And you realize, if you look at kind of a thing that quite shocking, if you look at people, how much it costs to live somewhere, cities that you think of as having relatively cheap housing, like Houston, actually the proportion of income that people spend on housing and transport combined in Houston is higher than somewhere where we think of as an incredibly expensive city, New York. People in New York spend less on transport and housing combined than people in Houston, because in Houston you've got to run a car. It's $11,000, I think, is the estimate that the federal government has for how much it costs to run a car per year. That's a huge chunk of money. So financially, in this extraordinarily rich country, people are having to spend an awful lot of money on cars, which are not always kind of making them happy, basically. And that's the second part, is that driving and being particularly kind of urban, commuter driving makes people really unhappy. There's a study that McGill University did, one of the ones I cite in the book, that shows that kind of every type of kind of transport getting, as a way of getting to work, of commuting, car driving is by far the least popular. People don't like being reliant on taking the bus to work, but they like it better than driving themselves. The most people who walk to work or take a bike to work are by far the happiest by a long way. So being reliant on a car to kind of, sitting in traffic every day, it's stressful and it's tiring, and people hate it. And there's like, I think there was another study I cite from Sweden which showed that car commuters are more likely to get divorced. It's the thing that people most hate about their day. And you can see actually in the kind of post-pandemic world in the US, in America has really struggled to get people back into the office in the way that a lot of European cities haven't. And I don't think it's that people hate going to the office. People like going into the office to work. What they don't like is sitting in traffic for 45 minutes each morning and evening, fighting with all these other people trying to do the same thing, worrying about parking. So that kind of car-centric thing is struggling, it's making it harder for people to get back into work at the moment, because they've realized, oh God, this is miserable. And if I can work from home, even if there's some disadvantages, I will. So it makes people really unhappy, as well as costing them a fortune. And I think we don't kind of account for that properly.
Yeah, we definitely don't. We don't also, we're kind of thinking about solutions to that, right? The biggest solution right now, I think, to the car's impact on the planet is electric vehicles. That's at least being proposed as the solution, right? And of course, electric vehicles are so much better for the planet than the gas guzzling cars, for many reasons. But EVs don't solve the problems that you just described, right? So how will the proliferation of EVs only exacerbate many of the problems that cars present today?
So the thing I worry most about EVs, and and I think it is worth noting they are much, much better for the climate than, than petrol powered vehicles. And there are concerns, which I write about in the book, about where, stuff like the batteries come from. But I have two concerns. First, I don't think that we're going to be able to get enough EVs kind of on the roads to mitigate the climate impacts fast enough. Second, everything you just said, they don't solve all these other problems. But the third thing that I worry about, that I think is really crucial, is that right now, while buying an electric vehicle is very expensive, charging it is really quite cheap. And so the cost of using your car, the marginal cost of using your car is quite low. And if everybody switches to an electric car and then they don't have, and then it's much cheaper per mile to drive it, I worry that people will use them even more than they currently use their petrol cars. And so the congestion will get worse, all the kind of the traffic problems, the risk, they weigh a lot, and which makes them more dangerous if you get into a crash. And there are 43,000 people died in car crashes in America last year, and that's risen a lot. And I worry that, these very heavy vehicles are not safe, and we're not solving that. And then, this could all get worse if people kind of drive them. And added to that is that right now, when like the cost of roads and the cost of road maintenance is paid for, at least in part. It's definitely not in full anymore, but it historically was paid in full by gas taxes, and now at least the gas taxes contribute. And and the problem with EVs is that you're not paying those kind of road charges either, and yet you rely on these roads, and so the general taxpayer is going to have to make it up. And there's already quite a lot of suburbs and suburban cities in the US which struggle as it is with the cost of kind of maintaining their infrastructure. And then so you're adding these very heavy vehicles, which, because they're heavier, will do more damage to the roads. And suddenly they're no longer, kind of paying gas taxes that would kind of pay for the upkeep of those roads. I just think there's a fiscal problem too. And, and are we really going to ask the general taxpayer, are we really going to ask people who aren't driving to pay more in taxes to essentially subsidize this kind of mode of transport that isn't paying for itself? So I think there's a kind of that, the worry is if people drive it, if electric vehicles are much cheaper to the individual, while costing the same to society, that people will drive them more and we'll all end up paying more. So I think that, it's quite urgent that while electric vehicles come on, and we do need to, probably do use subsidies to encourage people to adopt them, to switch from petrol, gas-powered cars to electric vehicles. We also need to make sure that we don't kind of have more driving than ever as a result of it, and that we don't end up just creating an enormous damaging thing to subsidize too. So I think that's the big challenge at the moment.
Yeah, another interesting point that you brought up in the book about whenever you buy an electric vehicle are those regulatory credits that are created for the manufacturer, right? And we've heard kind of news stories about how that was the only thing that was making Tesla profitable for the last few years, and I think that caught headlines. But I think the way in America under current CAFE standards actually makes it easier for car makers to sell those big gas guzzling SUVs when they're also selling EVs. So can you just explain how this works?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I feel like I should have been talking about this much more. But yeah, basically, and there's a similar system in the EU, by the way, but under federal kind of fuel economy standards, car manufacturers have to meet a fleet-wide average for fuel efficiency for their vehicles, which is something like 37 miles per gallon. Is the average car has to kind of meet that fuel efficiency. So for every electric vehicle that's sold, which obviously has the kind of equivalent of 100 miles per gallon or something, that reduces that increases the average efficiency of their fleet, so they can sell a much more polluting kind of vehicle more easily. And so for a long time, Tesla were making the bulk of their profit, as it were, came from the fact that they were selling the rights to other car makers, the credits to produce more polluting cars. I think now Tesla's profit has grown enough that it's no longer the whole part of it, but they still make hundreds of millions of dollars each year in selling these credits. So every electric car you buy, every electric car on the road allows another kind of Ford F-150 to be sold. And I do wonder about this because, if you look at my street in Chicago, obviously, people in Chicago don't have to drive that much. It's a dense city. There's about 3 Teslas, and they're usually just parked up all of the time. The people who own them don't drive very far, which fair enough, good for them. I'm glad, but they're Teslas that aren't really, they're replacing probably a gas car that wouldn't have driven that much either, have enabled some giant pickup truck or SUV to be sold, probably somewhere, let's say downstate Illinois, where everybody drives 40 miles each way to work every day. And so I do wonder slightly if the average electric car is probably replacing a car that was not driven that much at the moment, driven by some kind of bougie liberal person like me in a city. And meanwhile, the average kind of, really polluting car is being driven, in a rural area really, really far, whether because of the kind of EV credit thing or the fuel economy credit, whether it's more than cancelled out the kind of effect of buying an electric vehicle. I think it's something to really think about when you're buying an electric vehicle. And these rules are actually due to be updated, I think, at the end of this year. So it would be interesting to see whether some of those incentives change. Because at the moment, you buy an electric vehicle, you basically make it possible for a manufacturer to sell a big polluting SUV, as well. And we don't think about that enough. And it means that your kind of attempts to mitigate your emissions are slightly cancelled out, unfortunately.
I want to get your thoughts on those big polluting SUVs, because as someone coming not from America, I mean, what do you think of these gigantic passenger vehicles that have basically taken over every street and every parking lot in the United States?
Oh, it's horrifying. And it's happening in parts of Europe too. I mean, you see these very heavy vehicles more and more in the UK. It's less dramatic because obviously the price of fuel is much higher at home. But here the cars are enormous. They're so large, particularly the sort of lifted pickup trucks. The big SUV thing I expected, I guess. I mean, I find some of the very large ones to be horrifying. The pickup trucks, I find it so strange the way people drive pickup trucks and the pickup trucks are marketed as like a normal kind of vehicle to get around in, to like suburban families, rather than, entirely people who actually need that space. And I think also that one of the things that hasn't been considered enough is that there's an arms race going on at the moment, because if you're driving a small car, on the freeway, like surrounded by these big heavy cars, and you get into a crash, like, if you're 1 ton kind of, I don't know, Toyota Yaris gets into a crash with a 3-ton pickup truck, you're not going to do well. So, and I think it was the National Highway Administration. There was people are being encouraged to buy these heavy cars because you're safer if you're in a big heavy car and you get into a crash with another heavy car. But they are not safe for the people outside of them. They are so dangerous to pedestrians, to people in small vehicles. These higher up, partly because they're so much heavier and partly because they're so much higher up, these SUVs and these pickup trucks, they just result in death when they are in a crash so much more often. And I think it's probably not the only reason why traffic deaths have spiked in recent years. Because the number of these cars and the weight of these cars have been rising for quite a long time, and the big spike is literally the last 2-3 years. But it has to be one of the reasons why so many people are are being killed in car crashes. And it's not just being killed. I mean, 42 to 53,000 people a year are killed in car crashes in the US, which is appalling. But something that I was staggered when I kind of looked it up was how many, over 1 million people are seriously injured every year in car crashes in the US. Something like 4.5 million people get into car crashes that require, an amount of hospital treatment. And if you kind of add up the probabilities, you are more likely than you are not over a lifetime to be involved in a serious car crash in America. You have something like a 65% chance of being involved in a serious car crash over a 30-40 year lifespan. So it's horrifying how much death cars cause just directly, and these really heavy vehicles are way scarier, they're way more damaging, and no manufacturers are being held to account for the fact they are selling, much more dangerous cars.
Yeah, and it makes walking and biking that much more dangerous and less desirable in those cities, right, where these gigantic cars are on the road. Now, I want to start talking about solutions here in the remaining time that we have. And Paris's mayor, Anne Hidalgo, has made international headlines for transforming the city into a more bike and pedestrian friendly one. So how did she do that? And what can other cities learn from her efforts?
So Paris is amazing, and I did what's happened there is incredible, and I did some reporting there for the book, and I think it's kind of it's interesting because they've had this phenomenal success in through kind of incremental changes. So when Hidalgo actually wasn't the first mayor to start on this, I can't remember the name of her predecessor, but it started with closing a motorway that had run along the one of the banks of the River Seine. I can't remember which bank it was, the left bank, I think, and then the right bank came later under Hidalgo. And but she started closing these kind of big like motorways that had been built in the 60s, and they've turned them to parks. And that started initially as this summer experiment, about 20 years ago, where they turned it into Paris Plage, into a kind of a beach for people to go to in the summer. And then it became permanent, and then they did the other side, and that's become permanent too, and it's this beautiful park. And then more recently, they've been getting rid of parking spaces. They've been getting rid of putting in lots of bike lanes and narrowing roads, making it basically trickier to use a car and a lot easier to particularly to cycle around Paris. And it's been phenomenally successful. And there was initially quite a lot of resistance. People were quite angry. There was this legal challenge against closing of the motorways, and this idea that it would cause traffic mayhem. But in fact, under the way the law works in Paris, the chief of police in the city had the kind of ability to undo some of these changes that the mayor was doing, if they ruled that it would cause lots more, that it was causing kind of traffic mayhem. And they didn't. Because what actually happened was that people did just stop driving. So the traffic didn't get any worse. In some places it actually got better because people had better alternatives. Paris used to be this incredibly kind of traffic clogged city with cars everywhere, and and it's very narrow streets, and now it's just not at all, because the amount of people driving has just collapsed. And I think one of the things that I think is really striking about what's happened in Paris is that they've done it through these quite subtle ways of narrowing an individual street at a time, of getting rid of parking spaces, of closing certain roads. What they haven't done is what, I think, what London did, which was introduce a congestion charge, and trying to raise the cost of driving. And I think maybe one of the lessons for Paris, particularly when you come to look at the United States, is that if you can kind of build those quite incremental things, if you can go street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, then you can kind of build up a critical mass. Whereas, the difficulty with something like the congestion charge, and I think the congestion charge would be an excellent policy, but if you look at how incredibly difficult it's been for, say, New York City to get past the political objections, and it will happen there, but if New York City really struggles to do it, then somewhere like Chicago, I think the politics of doing congestion charge will be really hard. But if you do begin by kind of going neighborhood by neighborhood and narrowing some of those most dangerous roads, taking out some parking spaces, that those measures are they can have a pretty big impact too, and you'll get to the point where you could do them quietly and people will not, people will see the results instantly and they won't worry so much about, oh gosh, well, all the things that they worry about with congestion charges of, oh, what if I have to drive my elderly grandmother to the doctor and I can't afford that $10 kind of thing that so animates the politics against it. So I think sort of the lesson from places like Paris is that you sort of need to sneak it through sometimes. And you need to work, if you work neighborhood by neighborhood, things like parking, things like bike lanes, they'll be controversial too, no doubt, but you can bring them in and then people will see that they work. And so it's not such a big bang attempt. You can do it neighborhood by neighborhood, and then people in one neighborhood see what's happened in the one next to it, and they're a little, more persuaded that this is a good idea. And it reaches, and what's happened in Paris is that it reaches a kind of, what starts with relatively small things snowballs into this very rapid change where, very few people are driving except for the kind of trips which, there are always going to be trips for which a car or a vehicle is going to be kind of the best alternative, but there may be 10% of trips. So once you can get down to that only those trips are left, and those people who do absolutely need to drive are like, okay, great, well, I'm not stuck in traffic at least, and I'm kind of, I'm collecting this item of furniture or whatever, and they don't think of using a car for going to the shops to get a pint of milk, because it just seems silly, and it would be silly, and so people's kind of expectations adjust.
Yeah, it's that principle of induced demand, again, working this time in the favor of bikes. And I think you see that, obviously now in Paris. Amsterdam is a great example of this. I mean, reading your book was the first time I kind of thought of Amsterdam as a car city. I mean, you go to Amsterdam now and it's just, obviously it's just almost 100% biking and walking, but that hasn't always been the case. So it's clear that, regulations work and people actually like biking, right? They enjoy, whether it's, even in places like Copenhagen where the weather isn't great, you still see a ton of biking. So it's that, if you build it, they will come. People will bike if you just make it safe for them and, make it convenient.
Absolutely. And I think it's, people say, oh, well, you'll never be able to make kind of American cities like bike friendly, European cities are so old and blah, blah, blah. But Copenhagen, Amsterdam, if you look in the 1960s, you can find pictures, Paris as well, of kind of cars everywhere. You can find pictures. When I was reporting in Paris, I saw this picture that they had on display outside one of, the where they put in a new bike lane, which showed, kind of around Notre Dame, just essentially the entire courtyard used for car parking. Every space of European cities was kind of used for car parking in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And we've undone that. And, an American, it's going to be hard to retrofit Houston, but like Chicago is a city that would be so easy to make more walkable, because it's an old city too, and it was a walkable city, and to some extent still is, but it would be so much easy. It would be so easy to change that, and in exactly the same way that Paris has recently, and that Amsterdam and Copenhagen did 30 or 40 years ago began to change it. And I think it actually is beginning to happen. It's just we're so much earlier in that stage, in that kind of process at the moment in the US.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like we've seen with so many attempted improvements to society today, there is this manufactured hysteria around these solutions, right? This war on cars. Right now, like bizarrely, the thing that the right-wing media is going after are 15-minute cities, right? For some reason, these have grabbed the attention of Republicans and, and their media puppets. Where does this come from? I mean, maybe first start with what are 15-minute cities, and why is this pissing off so many conservatives in America?
So 15-minute cities is this idea that Carlos Marino, which is this academic at the Sorbonne in France, came up with. It's basically this idea that you should be able to do, not everything, but most things you need in your daily life within a kind of 15-minute journey by public transport or on foot or on a bicycle. It's interpreted different ways. I think the way I generally think of it is, it's like, you should have a grocery store, a doctor, your child's primary school. An awful lot of kind of daily life things should be within 15-minute cities. A big city, it's never going to be realistic to have everything within 15 minutes, and that would be quite kind of bad, because cities get their strength from being how big, but everything that you kind of need as like an errand should be within 15 minutes. And the way this has become a kind of conspiracy theory, I think it's wild, but I think it kind of talks to something that a phrase that I use more and more, and that I actually wish I'd used in the book, because I don't think I do, although I do talk about it, is this car brain. And I think basically, if you've got used to using your car for kind of everything, it becomes very difficult for you to imagine getting any other way. And the way people talk about 15-minute cities, on the right, on the kind of people object to them, they talk about, oh, well, you'll be trapped in your neighborhood. You'll not be allowed to leave. Your ability to travel is dictated by bureaucrats, and so on and so on and so on. It's like, that's only true if the only way you can move is in your car. Like, it's totally possible to still get on your bicycle, to get into walk. Nobody's trapping you in any way. But I think there is this attitude that people who get very used to driving have, that they can't imagine doing anything else. And you see it not just in the discussion of 15-minute cities. If you look at the debate around the congestion charge in New York City, there's this constant example of, what about my elderly grandmother who's got to go see a doctor in Manhattan, and she really struggles to walk. Kind of like, well, it's, but people talk about it as though they are being banned from driving into Manhattan, and they're not being banned from driving into Manhattan. They're being asked to pay, a fee for the use of the roads. And if you're going to see a doctor in Manhattan, one thing I do know about living in America is that an extra $20 in the congestion charges is the least of your worries if you're going to see a very fancy Manhattan oncologist. Like, just ask the doctor. He will probably go, okay, fine, I'll take the $20 off your bill because you had to pay that to come and see me, off the thousands of dollars he'll be billing you otherwise, or your insurance. So I kind of think that an awful lot of the objections and this kind of conspiracy theory thinking at the extreme end of it comes from the idea that people are they've got so used to using their cars that even being asked to pay like a small fee or to take a small diversion feels like they're having their movement controlled, and in a way that they don't think about anything else. I think it's this just wrapping up of people's identities with their vehicle, and I think it's partly ironically because driving is so miserable and so stressful, that if you are then asked to pay a bit of money on top, or you're asked to to divert because you can't go down, because a street suddenly has been closed at one end so that you can't use somebody's residential street as a kind of through street to make a shortcut. People go, a subset of people, and I actually think that the people who are so loud about this, and they are very loud, are actually, a relatively small minority in most cities. They're just the ones who turn up at meetings. But it drives them mad. It drives people completely mad, basically driving everywhere. And they can't imagine any alternative. So they get really upset that it could get even worse. This miserable thing that they're having to do could be even worse.
Yeah, I hate it. Nobody likes driving in traffic. My favorite cities in the world are cities that are easily to get around, whether with walking or public transit or whatever. So, reading your book, it's very helpful to know kind of how we got here. And it's also inspiring to see what other cities have done to solve this car crisis, and that there is a better way. The solutions are out there. Like so many things, it just takes political will to actually get them done. Daniel, we've just scratched the surface on this book. I think if any of our audience wants to learn more, which I definitely recommend this book, and you should definitely check it out. We'll link to Carmageddon in the show notes so that anybody that wants to get the book, go buy the book, learn about this very thorough history of the car and its impact and really domination of our society, and how it's impacted humans and the planet negatively. Like, it's not, it's been a pretty net negative, all being said. So thank you so much for writing the book. And thank you, Daniel, for joining me today on the Climate Pod.
Thank you ever so much, Ty, for having me on. This was a joy, a real pleasure.